Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, and I want to welcome you to our final chair chat as me serving as chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. The chair chats will be continuing, but we'll talk more about that at the end of today's conversation. But I want to welcome as my final guest as chair, my dear friend and colleague, Erica Powers of Albany, New York. Erica is a past chair of the ABA's state and local government section. She's also a lawyer in New York, where she has served as a mediator and transactional regulatory lawyer in Albany, New York. And she's also on the council of the ABA dispute resolution section and has been very active in the ABA for many years, also in the State Bar of New York, serving as secretary of the New York State Bar Association. Erica, welcome. Glad to have you today.
Well, thank you. I would correct one thing. I'm secretary of the dispute resolution section.
I'm sorry. Not the entire state bar.
I'm not secretary of what we call the big bar.
Okay.
They would be offended.
We want to clarify that, right?
We want to clarify that. It's lovely to be here. And, you know, heirs property is something that is very dear to my heart. I feel honored that with Thomas Mitchell, who has done this work for so many years, that he's really become Mr. Heirs Property. He is a MacArthur Fellow for his work. He has an institute at Boston College Law School, and he was the lead editor of this book, and I came along and helped with 4 of the chapters and some introductory stuff.
Good. Well, if he's Mr. Heirs Property, we're going to call you Mrs. Heirs Property.
Well, Ms. Heirs Property.
Let's jump right in. You referenced the book.
Yeah.
I have a copy here that I have read, and I was honored to contribute as one of the commenters of the book a few years ago when I was chair-elect of the section. It's got a lot of good information, but let's start with some definitions. What is heirs property and what is its history?
Okay, so heirs property is basically real estate that has passed from one generation to the next without people having a will. So technically it's passed through intestacy. And what this means is that people have large families, and if you die without a will, then all of the people in your family own the property as tenants in common. And that means that they cannot borrow money or raise money to pay taxes or enter into a contract to fix the roof without having everybody who is a tenant in common sign on. So what has tended to happen is that in the African American community in this country, which is where Thomas has done much of his work, it was not possible for former slaves who actually were given 40 acres of land and a mule. Not everyone was, but although it was promised, but some people got it. It wasn't possible for them to write wills because no lawyer, the lawyers all being white, told them that they needed a will. And the justice system, the legal system was such in the Jim Crow South and in the Reconstruction tending into Jim Crow South, was that nobody said, if you don't have a will, then you're going to have these legal problems of clouded title and so on. So you go out 5 generations, you have a large farm family, you have 10 people in the family. Mom and dad die, the mule dies, the kids all have more children. And suddenly, 5 generations out, you might have as many as 500 people who are related to one another, who are tenants in common. And one of them may have a 1/8 share of this property, and one of them may have a 1/64 share of this property. And very often they don't know who one another is. You and I have joked about this, but I have said this is the book you take to your family reunion. And you pass it around and you say, we really need to figure some of this out. Some of what has happened is that people, there may be a lot of people living on, or relatively large number of people living on a small piece of land. So there may be a piece of land that might have 3 trailers and a falling down house, and the house is falling down because you can't find all the people who you need to get to consent to fix it up. Or, you know, a hurricane came through, but you can't get FEMA money to fix it up. And so there are title problems that are really of great magnitude. And then what happens is that predators come in. And so, for example, in the Gullah area, in the Gullah Geechee area, where resorts have been built, the reason that resorts were built in the Carolinas and in Georgia was that one developer would go and find one person whose education was not that great and say to that person, you have, because this guy had done research at the Registry of Deeds, you have this little interest in this land, and it's not worth $50, but I'll pay you $300 for it. And all they needed before this act was passed was to buy 1 share. And then the next day they would go to the courthouse and force a sale. There would be no notice to the other 499 people who were tenants in common. And for $1,000, they would buy land that was worth a great deal more.
Right.
And it's absolutely appalling. Thomas says he didn't believe it when he first heard about it. And then he did some research, and then he became an academic, and then he started making this his life work. And so the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act is the result of some work that was done by a commission of the Real Property Trusts and Estates section that was looking into the whole issue and trying to find out what the impacts of partition actions were. Thomas was a young academic at the time. He was able to be brought into this study group, and he ended up as the second African American ever to chair to be the reporter who actually writes a Uniform Act for the Uniform Law Commission. And they wrote the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, and it went through the Uniform Law Commission to be approved by the ABA sometime around 2010 or 2011. And then it has to be approved by each state legislature. And in the last 12 years, it has been approved in 23 jurisdictions, 22 states and the Virgin Islands, and it's pending in 3 or 4 more. And in different states, it's been tweaked in different ways. So, for example, in New York, where there is urban property where predators go in and do incredibly nasty things. They will buy one share of, an apartment building in Queens that has, it's a 3-flat, and they'll buy one share, and then they'll buy the second share, and then for the third flat they will turn rats loose in the basement and turn off the electric, and in general behave badly. So when that actually happened in New York City, and the New York City Bar Justice Center, which does pro bono work, found out about it, with this wonderful little old lady in Queens who said, "I will not allow this." Scott Konofsky got in touch with somebody at a television station who was famous for doing investigative reporting. And all of a sudden, the little old lady was all over the news. And all of a sudden, people in the New York legislature couldn't wait to be the person who brought this law to fruition.
Right.
And in New York, they changed the law. Thomas came and testified and worked with the state bar and the city bar about it. And so they changed the law to mandate conferences, where if a partition action was going to be brought, there had to be a conference. And Scott Konofsky is now training the people, the court personnel who handle those conferences. But one of the things that happened under the Uniform Act in general is that if a predator shows up and they don't have 20% of the ownership, that they're just one share, they can't do very much. You have to have notice to all the players. So this book is really 3 books. One book is how do you get a uniform law written, and how do you get a uniform law enacted, and what kind of lobbying do you get to do. The most important chapter from my perspective is the first chapter, where Thomas lays out the history and the whole story. Then you get into passage. Then you get into how do you find the aiders.
Right.
And so there are war stories, as it were,
Sure,
which some of which are riveting, from South Carolina, from the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, and from Georgia to some extent.
Right.
But it's not just a Black issue. There are people in the Southwest where disreputable lawyers changed the laws so that the Spanish colonial land title world was abolished. And some of the very lawyers who were involved in changing the law, needless to say, then went in and invested.
Right.
Zuckerberg in Hawaii, 2 days before the Hawaiian version of the Uniform Act was effective, it had already passed. 2 days before the effective date, tried to bring partition actions against, I think, 8 Native Hawaiians. And there was such a row and such pushback that in the end, he only was successful in bringing a partition action against 1 Native Hawaiian. In Appalachia, the coal companies have been doing this to white folks forever. The law has passed in Connecticut. The law has passed in California. There are states that represent probably more than 50% of the population of the United States that now have heirs property actions. And in places, we're talking both about a law and a set of circumstances, and the aunts and uncles who hated one another at Thanksgiving, and therefore 30 years later, somebody's willing to sell out just because they're still angry at something that somebody said at Thanksgiving 30 years ago. But we're also talking about people who are afraid of going to lawyers. And this is where we as lawyers can help. Because, for example, in Montana, where there are ranchers, where there are some Native Americans, but the laws about property don't fall exactly within the Uniform Act. But where there are a lot of what my Montana chapter writer said were red state people who absolutely don't trust lawyers. And they're ranchers, and they have huge acreage, but there may be 3 members of a family, and they've had the same falling out for whatever reason. And they need to figure out what to do with land where you can't just divide it in 3 equal shares, because the water is only in one place and the roads are in a different place. And there's a mountain in the middle. And some of the land is arable and some of the land isn't. And
Right.
so there you are. And
So you touched on so many different points that I wanted to kind of circle back to.
okay.
One thing I want to just kind of get you to kind of drill in on, Professor Connor Bailey said that heirs property is the legacy of Jim Crow.
Yep.
What does that mean to you as a lawyer, as a person who studies history? Could you put that in some context for us?
I'll try. Connor Bailey is a rural sociologist, and he's based in Alabama. And he studies where he can get grants. So he's looked at, and I have an actual list, and it's alphabetical, so it's a little weird, but basically he's looked at the Black Belt. If you take Texas, East Texas, and go from East Texas east to the Atlantic, and then you go north to Virginia, and then you snag your way across West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, you can tell I'm a northerner, Oklahoma. In that particular area, which is primarily Black land ownership that he's looking at, although there are some people, some white folks in the hollers who've also included, he estimates that there is $47 billion worth of land that is in heirs property ownership. 580,000 owners. The Jim Crow aspect is that inferior education, segregated education over a period of generations, lack of lawyers who understand real property law and will work with people who are heirs property heirs, and all kinds of what we all know to be Jim Crow era voting issues and, skullduggery in general, exactly. Have resulted in land that is prey to having unscrupulous people come in and take advantage of people. and it's terrible.
Yeah.
But as lawyers, what can we do? Well, among other things, we can try to educate a much more diverse group of young lawyers. We can try to, and I teach dispute resolution at Albany Law School, so I get to do a little bit of this. We can try to encourage lawyers who are Black and brown and Native Americans, Asian Americans, to learn real property law, to learn estate planning, to discover that it's quite exciting intellectually. You have to kind of light a fire under them to do that, but trust in estates. Oh, my eyes glaze over, but you try and produce a generation of young lawyers who look like the clients and who the clients will trust and can trust because they're very well trained and they look like you. One of the chapters in our book is by Mavis Gregg, and it is about how to choose a lawyer.
Right.
And she writes about how she was a young Black lawyer in a white shoe law firm in DC doing work that had nothing to do with heirs property. And then her parents and I think a grandmother and some other relatives all were wiped out in a car accident. And she had said to her parents, "You need a will." And they said, "Oh, no, you're a lawyer. You'll take care of everything." And she said, "You need a will." And they said, "Oh, no." And then they died. And she and her brother and sister and cousin had to sell all the property that had been in their family for over 100 years in order to pay the taxes. Right. And she started practicing heirs property law. And she writes about how you choose a lawyer.
Right.
It's absolutely riveting.
So before we share with people how to get a copy of the book, I wanted to connect this work with the theme of the bar year that we are just concluding for our section, which was economic justice. We had a series of conversations this year around economic justice issues. We had an economic justice summit in March at the Georgetown Law Center where we lifted up a lot of these issues, particularly around property and environmental law. Estate planning came up as well. I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the relationship between heirs property, the issue of reparations, and economic justice?
Well, I'm very committed. I was an environmental lawyer before I became a mediator. Yeah. And I'm very committed to economic justice in the sense of public health, in the sense of sewer systems. I mean, these are not exciting things to talk about, but they're really important. I think that there is some very interesting work going on. For example, Evanston, Illinois now is using cannabis money to make it possible for people who are citizens of Evanston and who, due to zoning and various other things, were not ever able to buy property in Evanston, to get down payments. So that's one slice of economic justice. Another slice is the work that's being done at Bruce's Beach in California, where a Black family who were deprived of their extremely good resort that they were running, now generations later are getting some justice. I think that we should put in a link to Thomas Mitchell's program at Boston College Law School, because it is an extraordinary program. It's called the Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights. And I would urge everybody who's watching this to go and sign on and get their blogs and just follow what he's doing. It's enormously exciting and very helpful. And he
should include that link.
Yeah, so we need to include that link. It's HTTPS, we'll put it somewhere, www.bc.edu content, BC Web Schools Law Centers Land Initiative. So
we'll make sure we get that out to everybody. Yeah. Erica, how can people get a copy of this great book?
Well, they can go to the ABA bookstore. Okay. And there is a coupon, a discount coupon for 25% off. I wish it were more, but getting 25% from ABA pubs is already a nice thing. So the coupon link will be there. Also, we did, if you want more Connor Bailey, we did a program on December 7th with the New York State Bar and ABA. Several sections of the State Bar, I moderated it. It was the dispute resolution section legislation.
This was last year?
This was last September of 22. But this section, civil rights and social justice was one of the sponsors. State and local was one of the sponsors. Dispute resolution was one of the sponsors. RIPETY, Real Property Trusts in the States, was one of the sponsors. And it's free. You hit the link and you put in a code, and we'll put the code in. That's something like Comp 81. And it's absolutely fascinating. And there are articles there also about everything from estate planning clinics in law schools to Connor's work and Connor's work going forward. So there we are.
Well, Erica, I want to thank you for your contribution to this very important subject. It is such a critical issue for so many families across the country. Mm-hmm. It impacts many African Americans, other people of color. It's an issue in my own family that we have dealt with. We're dealing with. So this is an important conversation that I hope people will continue to have. Read this important book.
And tell their friends and tell their pastors, because we need to somehow get this information out through churches, through places where people gather.
That's right. That's
just lawyers. So, and that's why parts of the book are really quite exciting, because some of them are, like watching soap operas,
I bet, right. Every family got some
that fell apart, in the middle of a mediation,
Right. So, Erica, thank you for being my guest today. And I want to take this time as a point of personal chair privilege and my final chair chat as chair of the section to say thank you to all of our guests throughout this year. We were able to record 53 different chair chats. We had over 60 guests. Some weeks we had multiple guests, so that's what we got, over 60. We had hundreds of viewers around the country and the globe. And I want to thank the viewers for tuning in, for people who shared the chair chat with their friends and colleagues. I want to thank all of our guests who came on and prepared themselves for this conversation. And I also want to thank our ABA staff, Allie in particular, for putting all the logistics together every week. There's Allie right there. You couldn't see her every week, but she was always here, recording, editing, and planning for the future or the next chair chat. So, Allie, I want to thank you as well. We couldn't have done this without you. And so it's a final goodbye as chair, but I'm still going to be around, and I look forward to the future of this chair chat conversation, which will begin tomorrow with an interview with our new chair, Robin Runge, who will serve as chair for the 2023-24 bar year. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for being part of this important conversation throughout the year. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.